this week I reviewed Bridget Jones' The Edge of Reason, and if you saw my review, you know my thoughts on that movie. And if you haven't, there's a link for it right here. But even though I personally found it to be a guilty pleasure of mine, I will honestly admit that it has huge problems. I know that they've been trying to get a Bridget Jones free movie off the ground for many years, and Helen Fielding even released a third Bridget Jones's book, but from what I've heard of the book, thank God they didn't adapt that one into a movie. However, Bridget Jones 3 is finally out now. The big climax of the Bridget Jones trilogy, Bridget Jones's Baby. So what did I think of it? Well, let's go over the plot. 15 years after the events of Bridget Jones's Diary, when Bridget and Mark finally got together at long last, they've broken up. And Bridget is once again single in her 40s. She has a good job as a producer on this news channel, and she's still friends with Shazza and Jude and Tom and that old gang from before, but she's also friends with the host on her news show, Miranda. Yet there's a part of her that's still not 100% over Mark. So Miranda decides to take her on holiday to this music festival, where she bumps into an American man named Jack, played by Patrick Dempsey. They hook up while they're there, and everything should be fine for Bridget. But then she happens to also bump into Mark while at a friend's christening, and she hooks up with him as well. And shock for shocks, a few weeks later, Bridget discovers that she's pregnant and she doesn't know who the father is. Hilarity and hijinks ensue, except this time not necessarily in an awkward way. The narrative of this film feels way more natural and story-driven than Bridget Jones' The Edge of Reason did. There's a lot more focus on the characters and actually trying to tell a decent story, instead of just piling in jokes and references. Hey, here's a reminder, Bridget Jones' Diary existed, remember that, remember that, ha ha ha! But anyway, let's actually talk about the characters. First of all, we'll start with Bridget, and I'm going to drink some tea while I think of what to say about her. Renée Zellweger is back as Bridget Jones, obviously. It's really interesting to see this character much older and obviously more experienced in life, both in a personal and professional sense, because she's no longer just a reporter, she's actually running the news show now. And there's a brief throwaway line about how she's finally at her ideal weight. I guess they couldn't get Renée Zellweger to do another great big weight gain regime or something like she did with the first two movies, so I'll buy that. And I also really liked in the very beginning of the film, where it's basically a throwback to in the very first movie, where she's sitting on her own, moping to herself, and all by myself is playing in the background. Then she just goes, oh fuck off, and plays some funky music instead. And I loved that throwback actually, because it really sums up the mood of the film. It's not going to be some dumb, depressing sequel where everything's changed and it's all moody and miserable. And Bridget Jones's story this time round is actually solid and interesting for once, because even though she's doing fine on her own, it is very clear that she still has some feelings for Mark, but at the same time she's really attracted to Jack. But it's not quite clear if she's totally in love with him. The fact that she's not sure about how she 100% feels about either Mark or Jack makes this story, this whole love triangle, very interesting. Because it could be just so easy to say, well, she's obviously going to get together with Mark in the end, so what's the point of this story? But Bridget's dilemma feels natural. But then she also starts to have problems at work, when this new management of younger, cool people who are into Instagram and social media and iPads and other modern, young person, millennial things. And they kind of make Bridget feel a little more shit about herself, because, oh great, the light's changing. This is what happens when you record with the windows open. I mean, I just wanted more light. It's not like I have a professional studio with lighting or anything. God, I need to put that on my Christmas list. But as I was saying, Bridget is once again feeling stressed out at work because of these young people who don't really take her seriously. And yet at the same time, I have to admit, Bridget is rather bad at her job. For example, there's this scene near the beginning when Bridget's trying to help her interviewer, TV presenter friend Miranda conduct an interview with this, I want to say it's like a world leader or something, my memory is just a little bit sketchy. But then she gets a phone call from her friend Tom in the middle of the thing, and she's trying to speak to him at the same time, but her microphone giving instructions is on, and there's this awkward dialogue of miscommunication between the host and the interviewer. It's quite funny the first time round, and that's fine. I can tolerate awkward humour. That's the whole point of Bridget Jones. It's funny, I get that. But then later on they do it a second time, but it's with Jack Quant, who is Bridget Jones's new love interest, because she's managed to secretly get him as a guest on the show, but really it's just a ploy to figure out whether he's really the father of her baby. And it's so awkward because Miranda's asking him stuff about like his bloodline and his sperm, whether he's seeing anyone at the moment. And again, I can tolerate that for the sake of the plot. But then they do the same joke again much later on, and it's the most awkward one of all, because the show's managed to snag an interview with this dictator, and Bridget sees him at the corridor and she drags him off to the interview room and stuff, and Miranda's asking him pressing questions about the rebellion going on in his country, and he seems really awkward and sweaty and shaking. You think, okay, that's fine. But then the manager comes along up to Bridget and gets really shouty at her because it turns out she's got the actual dictator right next to her, and the person they've managed to get for the interview, it was actually the chauffeur. So, congratulations, Bridget. You're incompetent at your job and also kind of a racist. And it's immediately followed by this scene where the millennial young person manager fires Bridget for being bad at her job, like a normal boss would do. And Bridget makes this big speech about how what they're doing on the show now isn't really news and it's all dumbed down, and when her child grows up she's going to teach it about integrity. Except that in this case, the boss is right. Bridget is a terrible producer from what we see on screen. It's just a little nitpicky thing, but it's like, no, Bridget, you do suck. This is all on you. Man, maybe I should get this tea out of the shop. But other than that, the story is really good. And I liked the love triangle plot, a sentence that no critic in the history of anything has said about any piece of media with a love triangle plot, because both Mark and Jack are really interesting characters. Obviously, Colin Firth is there, playing Mark again. He's still a bit awkward and a bit of a stick in the mud. And we get to kind of sort of see why Bridget and Mark originally broke up. It's mostly because of Mark always working a lot and always being too stiff, and Bridget being too awkward and hard to deal with. Which, in a way, I think that little character thing about Bridget being the liability was a subtle apology for her characterisation in The Edge of Reason and for that dumb breakup plot, because here it's actually addressing how both their behaviour seriously affected their relationship in the long term. And even though he's still rather quiet about it, it's very clear through his actions and things he says that he does still love Bridget somewhere. And you'd think it'd be as simple as that they just get back together in the end, all happy ever after, right? Well, not quite. For a start, I find it interesting how Mark's still being in love with Bridget's character subplot thing could have been really awkward, and he could have just come across as this annoyed, nice guy who just hates the new person in Bridget's life and just wants her all to himself. But in a way, that whole character arc is deconstructed, both with Mark and with Jack, played by Patrick Dempsey, who was an excellent newcomer in this film. He really had the whole charming American, peace-loving, Prince Charming stereotype down to a T, which kind of makes sense, seeing how he played McDreamy on Grey's Anatomy for many, many years. And him and Bridget actually do have nice chemistry and nice cute little moments together. There's this scene after he finds out that she's pregnant. He comes round to her house and he apologises about how everything's been rushing between them, and he jokes about how if they had a second date he would have taken her to this restaurant. He actually brings the food over as a takeaway, and he talks about how their next date they would have gone to the seaside and he would have won her this cuddly toy. He gives her a toy monkey. Wait, it's an orangutan. Orangutans aren't monkeys, they're apes, what am I saying? And then he surprises her with this huge bunch of flowers, jokes about how it's an apology for making up for their first fight, and then he brings her this IKEA bedstand thing to represent how they're like making furniture together. It's a charming little scene, admittedly. It's a little too over the top, but it's still quite nice, I guess, because Patrick Dempsey has the charm and charisma and the general Americanness to go along with what a trite little moment it would be on paper. But the love triangle still remains an integral part of the story, and it's still handled surprisingly well, because both Mark and Jack are very protective of Bridget, and they both think that they know what's best for her in their own unique ways. Jack is a little more down to earth and a little more caring. He just wants love for everyone around him because he's this nice American chap. And he also happens to be a billionaire. He runs this sort of matchmaking quantum theory thing on the formula for true love or something like that. But it also turns out that he's not quite perfect. There's this brief moment when he tries to ward Mark off by implying that Bridget's baby was definitely his because they weren't wearing a condom, and he admits this to Bridget later on and genuinely apologises for how selfish that was. And this was the turning point for me for this character, not necessarily in a bad way, but in a more positive way. But it turns out that Jack is actually a really good, solid character, with flaws and imperfections and a decent personality. You also root for him, and it makes the love triangle even more complicated because you want to see Bridget and Mark have their happily ever after, but Jack also seems like a really honest, decent person. But then again, there's also the third option for Bridget to go about things alone. And there's this brief scene when she talks to her baby doctor, played by Emma Thompson, whose character is one of the standouts in this movie. She doesn't have many scenes or lines, but she's a little bit sarcastic, but also charming and witty at the same time. And it's Emma Thompson, and you gotta love her. But anyway, Emma Thompson's character reveals that she raised her own child without a man in her life, and suggests that Bridget is more than capable of doing the same. But at the same time, it's a little confusing how it tries to be progressive about implying that it's okay for women to look after babies on their own. Single mothers are fine. Bridget's a strong female character. She can do this. She's the best. And yet go with the normal love triangle, have to choose one guy thing at the same time. But I think this movie, for the most part, works around this issue just fine, thanks to the good writing and the strong performances between all of the cast. Which reminds me, I need to get to the supporting characters. All your old favourites are back. Bridget's friends from the first two movies, Bridget's mother, her father. Bridget's mother has a rather funny subplot where she's trying to campaign for local election in the village. Some of her views aren't very politically correct, so Bridget calls her out on that, and that's kind of played for laughs because we know that her mother is in the wrong in this situation. It's quite funny because we all know people in our lives, whether they be old relatives or otherwise, who say problematic stuff but they don't mean it, they're just trying to help. But speaking of progressive stuff, the one little nitpick I also have to make with this film is this other subplot where Mark is defending this band who's an obvious parallel to Pussy Riot. You can tell that this script spent years in development hell, couldn't you? But it's treated in a very sarcastic way, like even though their music's not good, they deserve to have equal rights. And there's this scene later on where Bridget goes into labour, she's trying to get to the hospital, but there's this huge traffic because there's this riot in defence of the Pussy Riot parallel band. There's this line, it's like, oh god, this traffic. And later on when Bridget's mother is also late because of the protests, she's like, oh, these feminists, they already have equal rights, what more do you want? And I know the joke's supposed to be that her mother's ignorant and old people say this sort of thing most of the time, but at the same time, the film's kind of implying that it's okay to protest for women's rights, but why can't you just be nice about it and be a feminist in the nice, friendly way? Like standing up for yourself at work, like Bridget does. I should point out that this film was actually really good, despite its flaws. It's still funny, there are a few little awkward comedic moments now and then, but it wasn't overtly distracting. And there were, I noticed, a few narrative callbacks to Bridget Jones's Diary, but it wasn't inherently obvious like Bridget Jones' The Edge of Reason. It's good to see Bridget Jones older, it's good to see her story being continued in some way. But anyway, there are a few more stuff about this film I want to get into, but before that, here's a quick warning, spoilers! Just like there is a very notable absence among the returning cast members, and that is Hugh Grant as Daniel Cleaver. Now, obviously you'd think, well, that makes sense, there's not much else they can do with this character. They already used him up in the first two movies, we don't need him to come back again. Well, Bridget Jones's Baby addresses that in the opening, because we see Bridget on her birthday having to go to Daniel's funeral. Yep, they killed off Daniel. First of all, the funeral scene is actually really funny because we see that a lot of the guests mostly consist of much younger women, and Bridget makes a joke about how the Eastern European modelling community must have really felt his loss, and one of the women there makes this speech about Daniel, and Bridget's able to recite it word for word because it's exactly the same bullshit that he used to say to her. He's just been doing this to other women for many, many years. Anyway, the ending of this movie. Now, I know for a fact that they actually shot 3 separate endings for this film. The ending that I saw, presuming that they haven't trolled the audiences by showing all 3 endings in different cinemas or screenings or whatever, was Bridget and Mark finally getting back together and getting married. And Jack's still a part of their life. He's holding her son while she gets married, and it's really nice to see that they're all still good friends. It's not just like with Daniel Cleaver, where he was an obvious arsehole with no sign of redemption. And speaking of Daniel, the very last shot of the movie, we pan over to a newspaper on the park bench which says that a certain familiar face has been mysteriously found alive after being presumed dead for over a year. No prizes for guessing who the familiar face is. It's like the writers or director of this film were like, okay, Hugh Grant, you don't want to come back for our 3rd movie? Fine, we'll just kill off your character in the opening scenes, and while you watch this amazing follow-up, you're going to be kicking yourself throughout for not agreeing to sign on board for it, but at the very end, we'll leave the door open for you to come back, because we're nice like that. And yet, as hilarious as that apparent sequel hook was, I personally thought that this movie was the perfect ending for the Bridget Jones series as a whole. She's had her fairy tale ending, her story, in my opinion, should be over. Bridget Jones's Baby may have arrived many years too late to some people, but it's still a fascinating continuation. And it's a hilarious story about the life of a woman in her 40s, and it tackles issues like single parenting and dating when you're older in an amusing and sincere way. All the actors in this film are good. It's really nice to see Bridget again. The atmosphere just feels really nice and calmer this time round in general. At the end of my The Edge of Reason review, I compared Bridget Jones's Diary to a mug of hot chocolate with whipped cream and marshmallows, and The Edge of Reason to a mug of hot chocolate with nothing else. Keeping with the hot chocolate metaphor, Bridget Jones's Baby was, in my opinion, a mug of hot chocolate with whipped cream and one of those wafer stick things. A little different, not quite as sweet as the original, but a little more sophisticated at the same time, and still fills you up with the right amount of goodness. And on that cheesy note, thanks for watching. Be sure to comment on this video and like it. Be sure to not dislike it. I'm looking at you, whoever you are. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and follow me on all appropriate social media sites. Next time on Poindexta, it's going to be October, the month of fright, the season of horrors. And what terrifying monstrosity will I be reviewing to commemorate the witching hour? K9 and Company. Hey, there's a new Doctor Who spin-off coming. I've got to catch up with the zeitgeist. Until then, this is Poindexta, and I am still falling for Bridget Jones. God, that was a lame pun.